Hi everyone, this is chapter 3 called Getting Started in the textbook by Larry Z. Leslie, Communication Research Methods in Postmodern Culture, a Revisionist Approach. So basically, as we jump into chapter 3, we're going to talk more so about basic terminology and really important content that you need to know as you dive into research methods within the communication research space, as well as the ways in which we start to think about the postmodern era's influence on communication research. So, some basic terminology for you. First is methodology. So, in your book, they talk about how one methodology or a methodology is the way that one goes about studying whatever is of interest. It relates to our process of inquiry, but it does not necessarily tell us what to expect to find. So, a methodology is a guideline of practices and guides, and this guides us through the process of our study. So, an example of a methodology would be an ethnography, carrying out an ethnographic study, or interviews, right? Face to face or in depth, focus groups, surveys, content analysis, so forth and so on. Those are all examples of methodologies that help us to understand the ways in which we can get the answers to the questions that we have. Current social science methodology within communication studies is organized mainly in two areas, and we'll still follow with that, and that's qualitative and quantitative. So, qualitative is language based, and these typically do not lend themselves easily to mathematical models, but they do lend themselves to other sorts of analyses. So, an example of a qualitative methodology would be an in depth interview, or an ethnographic interview, or an ethnographic study. Content analysis, which can be qualitative and quantitative depending on the type of studying that you're carrying out, focus groups, and then discourse analysis, as well as a myriad of other types of methodological spaces. And I like to say that when we're doing qualitative research, as a qualitative researcher, we're dealing not only with language and words, but we're dealing with ideas, we're dealing with emotions, we're dealing with all of the gray area things that we really don't know what we're going to do. Oftentimes, qualitative research can be described as muddy because you're not necessarily sure what's going to happen as you carry out your study, regardless of how much and how well you prepare. While on the other end, quantitative deals with numerical data, and this can be organized and analyzed using mathematical operations. So typically, quantitative we find does not deal that much with language, but deals more with numbers, more with trends. Quantitative methods also could be aligned in the areas of content analyses and surveys. Next, we have our variables. Your book gives some really great examples of a variable and how variables are defined, so I won't repeat those. When we think about variables, we want to think that a variable is an event or experience or some other phenomenon that a researcher wishes to examine. Variables can often be measured while some can be manipulated, and we'll talk about how those differ. So there are two types of variables, as you know. One is an independent variable and the other is a dependent variable. So, the independent variable is a variable that can both be measured and manipulated, okay? So we understand the cause and the effect when we're dealing with an independent variable, okay? When we have a dependent variable though, this is a variable whose value depends on that of another. So that would mean that the dependent variable can only be looked at based on the effect. It can only be measured based on the effect of something. It needs something else for it to make sense. And I'll explain this a little bit more. When we think about variables, we also want to consider that variables need precise definitions, and because of this, we must be sure that we are seeing what we think we're seeing. So we can't depend on our common definitions like we normally would in any other area to provide us with the specific information that we need. When we are using variables within our research studies, we have to define those, or we try to use variables or definitions of variables that have been used in studies that are similar to ours, but it's best for us to really define for our reader and for our study what we are trying to do and what these different terms mean. so that there's no confusion. The precise definition is also called an operational definition, and that is for each variable involved in the study. And you'll see that for different studies, some will share similar operational definitions, but when you break it down, there may be something that is not the same, okay? So you want to make sure that when you're thinking about the variables that you're using, that you have a clear understanding that you can articulate really well for different types of audiences for your study. This is just another example of an independent and dependent variable. So we're talking about how light affects plant growth. The growth of the plant would be the dependent, and that is dependent on the amount of sunlight, which is independent. Next, we're going to jump into reliability, validity, and theory. So, reliability gives similar, consistent results for each use. This is whether the technique applied repeatedly to the same object would yield the same result each time. It does not include accuracy. So, if we look at the bull's eye here, we can see that in the first picture, it suggests that, oh, well, the arrows are reliable, but they're not valid because they missed the mark. In the middle, the arrows are reliable and valid because they were shot and they hit the mark. And then the third picture, for some people, can be kind of confusing, but it suggests that not only are the arrows, unreliable, but that because they're unreliable, they're not valid. And so when we think about reliability, we want to make sure that we understand the difference between something being reliable but not valid. Validity then comes in as being true and accurate. This is how we empirically measure adequately what happens and how this reflects the real meaning of the concepts under consideration. So obviously, you would hope that whatever you're doing in your study, that whatever you're carrying out is reliable and valid, because this is going to make it seem like you've done it correctly, and also that you know what you're saying, that more than likely, if it's reliable and if it's valid, that this is something that we can carry on, this is something that we can trust. That's not to say, though, that if something is reliable and not valid, that is not worthy of reviewing. But obviously, as we've seen with clinical trials, as we've seen with trial and error, something that is reliable and valid makes a lot more sense and is a lot more convincing and easier to support than something that is reliable but not valid. When we think about theory, your book posits a very interesting idea, and I would love to hear what you think about that if you've already read, and maybe we can discuss this more in class. But they suggest that a theory is a statement or set of statements that guide the relationships among variables and provides us with a concept or a set of concepts about how reality works. Many postmodernists believe that theory is arbitrary, though, and this doesn't provide us with what we need to carry out research in today's culture. I would say that scholars across the board in communication studies and communication research, as well as in the social sciences, are probably on both ends of this. Many scholars would still suggest that theory is necessary because it helps to guide us, while, as you can see, within this postmodern era, we're kind of critiquing all of these foundational underpinnings that we have to say, well, why is it that we are making these generalizations, or why is it that we are critiquing a phenomenon or an event in this way, and that it can only be understood through this realm or through this set of lenses. So this is just something to think about when we consider how we're doing communications research within the postmodern era, as we try to move away from social science research, which we have been a part of for so long. Research guidelines. In your text, they talk a lot about how, the postmodern era influences what we do. And I thought that this quote speaks a lot to the way in which we should start looking at research in communication from the postmodern stance. It suggests that the purpose of research is to help us see and understand the interrelatedness and interdependency of people, communication, and media in contemporary postmodern culture. A culture that is marked by discontinuity and ambiguity. And I would love to hear your thoughts and your feedback about this. But when we see something like this and we think about this quote, I believe it's really powerful, given that we're challenging a lot of our fundamental and foundational knowledge, and we're making new meaning, and we are articulating that through the postmodern era. When we also view communication research within the postmodern era, that means that some of our viewpoints obviously will change. So your text talks about how most likely the way that we should view research done in communications from the postmodern standpoint is in the systems view. And this is when one looks at the world in terms of interrelatedness and interdependence of all phenomena. So this is when we bring into this pot, if you will, our physical, biological, psychological, social, and cultural experience and observations. And from the systems view, we find that all these things are interrelated. For some of you who have taken my classes before, we talk a lot about race, class, and gender. The systems view would definitely be something that would include race, class, and gender, as well as some of these other characteristics that are either socially constructed or not. Finally, your text talks about guiding questions in the postmodern era, and you'll see this throughout the textbook, and we'll discuss this a little bit more. But here are a few of the questions that they posit. They suggest that when we think about what we're trying to study and the questions that we want to ask within our postmodern world, we want to maybe say, what do we need to know in an uncertain and rapidly changing world? What are the root causes of problems, and how might they be solved? And finally, can personal meaning be located, and how is that meaning developed? So as you continue to read through your text and as we finish out this PowerPoint and slideshow, I want you to think about these questions and also review the rest of the questions on page 39 of the text, and let me know what questions you have and what you think about these questions, and maybe what other questions we can continue to ask that aren't covered in the book as it concerns how we look at phenomenon within the communications research space within the postmodern lens. This concludes our presentation for Chapter 3.